Addie Case, Cody Cornett,
Present.
John Grant,
Present.
Darcy Long, Tim McLaughlin,
Present.
Maria Pena, Harry Pipinich, Mark Popoff, Nick Portella,
Present.
Scott Randall,
Present.
Dan Richardson, absent. Rod Runyon is absent, and Mayor Mays is absent.
Thank you. The Pledge of Allegiance, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next is the approval of the agenda. If everyone has reviewed the agenda, may I please have a motion to approve it? And a second.
So moved.
Okay, may I please have a second?
Laughlin seconds.
A motion to approve the agenda has been made and seconded. All in favor to approve the agenda, raise your right hand, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Approval of the minutes from the July 18th meeting.
Opposed?
Any opposed to the approval of the minutes? Nope. Okay. Approval of the minutes from the July 18th meeting. If everyone who was here at that meeting has reviewed those minutes, may I please have a motion to approve them with a second?
Motion to approve.
Thank you. Thank you. A motion has been made to approve the minutes from the July 18th, 2024 meeting, along with a second. All in favor of approving the minutes, raise your right hand, say aye.
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 Any nays? Yeah, I'm also abstaining because I was not there.
I need you guys to speak into your microphones or I won't be able to hear you later. So Pipinich, Pena, and Cornett abstain.
Yes. Thank you. Now is the time for public comment. During this portion of the meeting, anyone may speak on any subject that does not later appear on the agenda. 5 minutes per person will be allowed. Are there any members of the public who care to make any comments? Okay, thank you. I'll take this time, since we're getting started, to introduce our new planning commissioner, Carrie Pipinich. Hello. Thanks for being a part of it. You're welcome. Next is a discussion item, 2024 housing production strategy, and I will hand that over to the masters of such.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Joshua Chandler, Community Development Department. As mentioned here, this is the third and final work session between the Planning Commission and the City Council. This is a process that we started in spring 2024. We've had quite a few meetings along the way, not only with this joint group, but also with an advisory committee and a project advisory committee. That advisory committee was comprised of local realtors, developers, advocates, service providers, and employers, as well as reps from Mid-Columbia Community Action Council, Mid-Columbia Housing Authority, Nichiwana Housing, and Columbia Gorge Community College. As I mentioned, the previous meeting, we've met before, the two previous meetings, May 2nd and July 18th. This has provided us the opportunity to ask for this group here to ask any questions and provide, any comments that you have to make sure that this housing production strategy aligns with our values. Additionally, the housing production strategy process included various forms of public outreach and coordination, including interviews with local housing producers and developers, and equity priority populations representing underserved and underrepresented communities. There's also a public forum held here as well as virtually on September 18th. And then there's currently a virtual open house and survey that has been available since August 19th to October 4th. So this is on the city's website. We have a page dedicated to this project here. Calling it a virtual open house is maybe a little misleading, but basically what it is it's a It's what's called a story map, and you can follow through. It's a web page dedicated walking you through this process. And at the end of it, there's a survey. And hopefully the information from that open house provides you with enough information to complete the survey. Lydia is going to touch on some of those responses from the survey here in just a little bit. And then notification of this work has been provided on the city's website, as well as on the Facebook page, city's Facebook page, and as well as multiple media outlets. As I mentioned, a complete list of all these meetings, everything that we've discussed is on a project specific web page on the city's webpage. So if you ever want to get caught up on it, or if anybody's asking questions that you run into in the community, feel free to direct them there. It's up to date. And we just, would like to appreciate everybody's dedication and commitment to this project, this very important project. It's going to be something that the city is going to go back to for the next 8 years to give us these tools and techniques that we can use to produce more housing for all forms of housing and for all different populations in our community. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Lydia Ness, who is with Cascadia Partners, our consultant with the project.
Is this working? Hello? Yeah, it's lit up, but
Need to get it closer, maybe.
can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure. Perfect. Okay. As Josh mentioned, for folks maybe I didn't meet at the last work session, my name is Lydia Ness. I'm a senior associate with Cascadia Partners. We are a planning and real estate firm based in Portland, Oregon, and we were hired to work with the city of the Dalles on your housing production strategy. I'll also pass it to my colleague who's joining virtually, Alex. Oh, we can't hear you, Alex. Okay, yeah, it looks like he's unmuted. Well, I'll go ahead and so Alex Joyce, he's the partner or the principal in charge for this project. So he's been helping to guide our team as we've developed this housing production strategy. All right, I will keep us going. So tonight, as Josh mentioned, I'll be providing some project updates, such as what we heard from you all last time, as well as the advisory committee meeting that we held earlier this week, and then some community engagement feedback that we've heard. But the bulk of the meeting will be to discuss the draft report. I have a few key actions to highlight, but of course want to save plenty of time for you all to provide your feedback, ask your questions, and ensure that the actions that we all have included in this draft you all support and want to see in the final version. And then lastly, I'll wrap up with some next steps. All right, with that, we'll move on to project updates. So quickly, just to remind folks where we are in the project. So you'll see the diamond number 3, that's where we are tonight. We held the advisory committee meeting on Tuesday of this week. But this is the last time that we'll be coming to you all for feedback. That's not to say after tonight, if you still don't have questions or comments that you want to ask, you can do so. But as far as a work session where we're here with you to kind of have a dialogue, this is the last time. And I'll get into kind of at the next steps as far as kind of what's to come with the timeline and such. But just to let you all know where we're at. As mentioned, so this is the third time. So we came here in May to kind of give you an overview of the housing needs strategies and actions and kind of talk with you all about preliminary strategy ideas. Came back in July to have a more refined list. And then tonight here is to further refine that list and make sure you all have your questions and comments answered. So it can be included in the final report. So last time we met with you all, from our perspective, it sounded like you all were pretty supportive of the actions presented. Many of you were interested in including triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage clusters in the pre-approved building plans action. There were some concerns around the administrative burden when it comes to the multi-unit property tax exemption program. There was a particular interest in actions that support affordable home ownership opportunities. And then lastly, there was support for inventorying land that is owned by the city, but also other agencies and jurisdictions that could have surplus land or other types of land that could be used for housing development. We do know that there is a list currently held by the city, but this is kind of going above and beyond that and including potential other agencies like the county or even the school district, for instance, other types of public and private or civic institutions that would have excess land. And even faith-based organizations, that could be another key partner for you all to consider when thinking about inventorying land. So key takeaways from the advisory committee meeting that we held on Tuesday. So the advisory committee is supportive of the draft report and strategies. The Housing Authority particularly highlighted that they have a community land trust already in place, which could be a really great opportunity for the Dalles to consider implementing some strategies such as the land banking strategy, which we'll touch on later tonight. The Mid-Columbia Economic Development District, so they joined this last meeting and already offered ways to support and partner with the organization on various strategies. So you have some really engaged advisory committee members that are interested in seeing beyond just this process, but as you implement this housing production strategy over the next 8 years. And then lastly here, the advisory committee recommended looking to other jurisdictions and how they've implemented various strategies and programs. So many of the ones even we'll touch on tonight, other jurisdictions have implemented those same types of programs and incentives. So looking to them for lessons learned or guidance as you consider those here in the Dalles. All right, on to the community engagement feedback. And at any point too, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to answer them. So as Josh mentioned, we've held and are continuing to hold multiple engagement activities. So the first one, as Josh touched on, we have interviewed and are continuing to interview priority populations and organizations that serve those populations. And so what we mean by that is underrepresented and marginalized communities. So we held a listening session with the Live Experience working group that works with MCAC. We're holding a meeting tomorrow with the Mid-Columbia Health Council and the Nichiwana Housing. And we're actively trying to also interview Bridges to Change and PCUN. We held a virtual open house and survey and are continuing to do that. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, it's an organization that works with, they're located at the Navigation Center. So when we were looking for populations to interview, organizations to interview, this was one of the groups that was actually recommended to us by the Navigation Center. And I believe the Navigation Center is the new social service offices that are out on West 7th Street.
Gloria Center.
Gloria Center.
Whoever's asking questions, I can't hear them at all.
I'm just asking what's the Pineros and Campesinos Unidos del Noroeste, because I never heard that before.
Yeah, it's an organization working with the Gloria Center. I believe they work with migrant workers, migrant farmers, trying to touch on the agricultural side of housing, as well as just providing any services to the Latinx community.
And if you have any recommendations for other organizations that serve. Mm-hmm.
It is an organization located, like I said, they're connected with the Gloria Center. So the Gloria Center has multiple organizations under one roof. Yeah.
So I think that when you do this kind of a stuff, and I know that you're not local, but I think you need to reach out to the local community, like meaning,
next door, a health department, one community health, people that work with local migrants and local orchard workers. So that way then you can get local input.
Hi, excuse me. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, that's my concern.
Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
we hear someone.
Hi, this is Jonathan Kara. I'm the city attorney.
Oh, hi.
The microphone on, and I'm appearing virtually. Whoever is speaking and has been speaking for the last 45 seconds, their microphone has been on. It just sounds like nobody's talking. I just wanted to flag that for the audience at home.
I think your microphone's off. Is the light on?
Now it is.
Thank
There
you
we
so
go.
much.
Thank you.
Maria, I would love to touch base after this meeting to talk to you about potential other
happy
organizations
to.
and partners that we could talk to that have a local presence as well. So I will touch base with you. Thank you for sharing that. So the third kind of activity that we've held, as Josh mentioned, was a community open house. And so I will be sharing some of that feedback right now. So some of the key takeaways we heard from that listening session or kind of community open house that was held on the 18th is there's an acknowledgement that there's a need both for affordable rental and home ownership opportunities, which is aligned with the data that we've conducted and analyzed, as well as kind of what we've heard from other groups and even you all. There's a need for higher density housing near transit and grocery stores or other goods and services that folks can access by foot or walking. Housing that's accessible in different ways, such as elevators, entries without stairs, and single-story homes. The entry without stairs and single-story homes usually go hand in hand, and folks don't have to go up and down stairs to access another floor. There was especially supportive related to cottage cluster housing for many different goals or needs in the community. So it was an acknowledgement of multi-generational housing, affordable home ownership opportunities, as well as accessible housing. So single-story homes, many cottage clusters have those. So it's an opportunity for folks to age in place. There was a priority for housing development in West the Dalles, which we've heard from many other folks as well. And then lastly is an emphasis on housing development that also has supportive services, particularly important for people coming out of homelessness. And so thinking about ways to include in different incentives or programs that the city pursues to think about how they can also support supportive services and housing development. Okay, so the virtual open house and survey. So it closes this weekend. So far we've had 107 responses, which is great. And I do want to note that while the survey closes this weekend, the virtual open house itself will stay open well past that. So if you know folks that still want to learn about this report or just have want to know more information, they can do so after this weekend too. It will still be open. All right, so this is some of the feedback that we've heard from the survey from those 107 responses. So the first one here was asking, how does your relationship describe it with the Dalles? So most of the folks that took it both live and work or study in the Dalles. We do have other folks that have taken it that either work or live in the Dalles. As well as they don't work or live, but potentially have a desire to move to the Dalles. Over 70% of the respondents own their home. So this may not be completely representative of the community as a whole, but as of the folks that have taken this survey, this is the makeup of them. So one of the questions we asked was considering the need for smaller homes. Which of the housing types do they think would best meet people they know? So not just looking at themselves, but thinking about their neighbors, their family members, other community members. What do they see as a need or have heard from folks? So the most common answer was the smaller detached homes on smaller lots. So something like a cottage cluster. But there is support almost half for attached homes. So thinking about duplexes, quadplexes, different housing types like that. And then after that, there's a pretty good similar interest in accessory dwelling units and manufactured or mobile homes. In asking the question of their experience, which types of homes, thinking about number of bedrooms, are the most challenging to find. So the two that were the most common were 2 and 3 bedroom. That's not to say that we don't know, acknowledge that there are different populations that may need even more bedrooms due to multi-generational living in larger families too. But this is a particular kind of challenge for folks, is the 2 and 3 bedroom. The next set of questions is looking at the regulatory action. So this is kind of understanding how can the city potentially incentivize different housing types or tenure or things like that. So the first one here is related to for sale homes. So most folks feel like it's either somewhat or very important for the city to prioritize opportunities to build more for sale affordable homes. The next one here is for rent. So there's an even higher importance for that. So over 75% of folks feel it's either somewhat or very important. Reducing barriers to unconventional housing types like tiny homes or modular homes. Again, this is a very important kind of opportunity for the city to take that folks feel that should be prioritized. And I do want to note that, for instance, like this question here really helps us kind of feel that we have the regulatory action that's related to tiny homes and modular homes. It's kind of reducing barriers is right in line with what the community is also giving us feedback on. The next one here is to prioritize using zoning rules to encourage builders to provide affordable units at either low or moderate incomes. Out of the one so far, this is the most important for folks. So almost 80% feel it's important or very important for the city to prioritize this, which again is in line with our recommendation for a strategy related to this. This next one here is essentially getting at the multi-unit property tax exemption program. So if the city were to offer a reduction in fees or taxes, what type of housing should receive that benefit? So it was pretty close between for sale homes and rental homes. So there's, I think, some opportunities there as the city looks to implementing a program like it's called MUPTI, the multi-unit property tax exemption, but I'll call it MUPTI because it's a mouthful. But you can also see here that there are still folks that feel homes that are designed to meet accessibility needs as well as supportive services are of interest as well. This next one here is essentially also getting at the construction excise tax. So if the city were to support a tax on new commercial and industrial development, would the folks taking the survey support that? So this one's a little bit more divided. It's still, if you look at the support or strongly support, it's over 50%, but there is 30% that either don't support it at all or just don't support it. So one to consider as this the city considers that program. And then lastly here is looking at would the city support or would they support the city working with other partners such as government agencies and institutions to look at housing or look at land that could be utilized for housing. And almost 85% of folks feel that that is something that they would support or strongly support. So that is, that's the feedback that we've heard from the survey. Are there any questions on any of the engagement activities that we've held or any of this feedback? Yeah.
So as far as the survey and how you collected the data, like I've done SurveyMonkey and you can do things behind the scenes. So I'm wondering, since 70% of those people were homeowners, I'm kind of brought up the thought of what's the demographic? Because younger people are not necessarily wanting to buy homes even on smaller lots. They're looking for other options. And since that population will be increasing and the older population will be decreasing, are we accounting for that? Or do we have a way of knowing how many of those renters maybe are like younger?
Yeah, so there are a series of questions after these here that are specific to demographics. So we ask age, household income, race, or ethnicity. So we have a series of data points that we could cross-reference with folks who said that they were renters, and we could look at, how many of them are at what age range or things like that. So we could kind of analyze the data in a couple different ways. But we do have that. And the last time I looked at that data, I didn't do that today, but it was pretty it was pretty even across the different age groups as far as the folks who took the survey. So yeah, but we could also analyze, we could take a look at just the renters who provided feedback. But knowing that that's a smaller sample size, that might only be 30 people or something who took that, who are renters who took the survey. So, but yeah.
I think mostly I'm just looking for an awareness that we just make sure that it's not skewed, obviously, or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, feel free to ask those as I continue if something comes up. So now we're going to pivot into the draft housing production strategy report, and then have plenty of time for discussion. So I know you've seen this multiple times, but just want to remind folks of the different categories of how we structured the report and the different actions and strategies within this kind of category wheel here. So we have partnerships, regulations, investments, incentives, and land. So each of the actions are in these different categories to kind of think about how they can meet these broader kind of tools that the city has. So here is the list of actions that is in the report. So there are 19 actions. I will acknowledge that the draft actions and strategies that you saw on July 18th, there were 27 strategies and actions. So this has been condensed. So the actions that are not in this list have been folded into the other actions and strategies that you see here. So for instance, you can see action 3.1, or I'm sorry, 3.2 is scaling system development charges. There was a different action under partnerships that was looking for the city to partner with the North County Wasco Parks and Recreation to also look at them scaling their fees based on housing size or number of bedrooms. And so we ended up folding that into action 3.2, just as the city is pursuing this to also engage the Parks and Rec district to consider if they can also scale their fees. So none of the actions here disclude the ones that you saw. They've just kind of been folded in. So if you have any questions on any of the actions that you don't see on this list that you saw in July, I'm happy to answer that. But as it stands, there are 19, and you can see here the implementation years. So as Josh mentioned, it's an 8-year plan. So each action kind of has a goal of what within those 8 years when the city would look to implement these actions. That's not to say that the city has to be beholden to this timeline. So if after the report is adopted, if the city is really excited about looking to implement the pre-approved plans, for instance, they could get started on that next year if they wanted to. So this is just kind of a guide so that the city isn't overwhelmed by implementing 19 strategies in year 6 or something like that. It's trying to kind of take a look at some of these maybe bigger actions are a little bit later so that in the interim, the city can start to make steps to implement that strategy in action. And then here on the very right, you can see the action impact. So the impact is related to how much of an impact it would have on meeting housing needs or different kind of housing types that are needed in the community. So some of the ones where it's direct investment or different types of reductions in fees, those are going to have a bigger impact because like having a reduction in your fees and things like that are going to be really instrumental in making projects feasible.
Lydia, quick question.
Of course.
I know that we can be flexible on, let's say, your example of pre-approved plans. Let's say we want to start doing them next year after that, something like that. I know we need to have basically progress reports to the state as this goes on. Is it, the same flexibility of moving an action forward? Can we punt an action further down the road, providing justification to the state?
Yeah, exactly. So the city has in the halfway point a check-in to kind of demonstrate how they're making progress on meeting these different actions. And so it's really just an opportunity for the city to also acknowledge that maybe one of the actions, you're not able to implement. And so is there an alternative? But you can also say, you know, in the report, we said that we would implement the strategy by year 4, but it's looking like it's going to be year 7.
Yeah,
Is
okay.
totally fine. It's just kind of giving them an update on where you stand on these different actions.
Okay. And some of these also in the event, you know, I look at urban renewal areas, you know, this is something that, you know, establishing an urban renewal area is something that could be potentially contentious because you're impacting so many taxing districts. In the event that we don't establish an urban renewal area, however, we go through the steps to at least get to that point where it's an adoption hearing, it's not adopted. Is that something that at least we check that box saying that we put all of our marbles into it and it just happened to not turn out?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So, for instance, with urban renewal area, we, in the title of the action, we say explore the city creating an urban renewal area because we know that it is not just you who can, in the end, implement that urban renewal area district. So, so really, yes, it's demonstrating that you explored implementing that strategy, and in the end, it resulted in not the creation of another district, but you took those steps and you
Okay.
um, and you made an effort to try to do that. So
Okay. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I have a few actions that I want to kind of talk through, and they're a little bit more complex. So I want to make sure you all understand them and have any questions that we can answer. But I also have questions at the end to kind of prompt some discussion. So I will do that, but feel free to chime in at any point.
A little more information on how you determined the implementation timelines? Like, is that something that you and the city staff?
Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, sorry. Can I just ask for a little bit more clarification on the implementation timelines and how the ones that were proposed were determined? And I apologize if you guys talked about this at a previous session, but just trying to get a sense of if this is to reflect, you know, some of the broader work going on at the city and priorities there, or if this is something that we might dive into a little bit more today.
Yeah, thanks you for that question. And this hasn't been presented before, so you're right on track with catching up. So this is something that we worked with the city on. So for instance, some of these regulatory actions, you can see there's a couple here that are within that first 2 years. So some of these are a little bit easier to kind of package together and implement, but again, this is the draft, so the city can still weigh in on these implementation years and can refine them, given that, you know, there are more within the first half. So that is something that can be modified. And so if you all have feedback too, would welcome that.
Yeah, and even if it's not tonight and, you know, anybody wants to think on these, if you know of any other initiatives that may make these a little easier to move forward in the first or second years, we're all ears. You know, like I said, this is we're looking at adoption probably in January, so we do have some time. And by all means, feel free to shoot us an email, any recommendations or suggestions you may have on it.
And some of these, so for instance, that action 1.1, which is recommending that the city form a housing working group, that can really help to identify other key partners that can help implement these strategies. So there are a few that we would recommend be implemented sooner rather than later because they can help with other strategy implementation down the line. So that's another kind of point to make too.
So is this a draft of just a bunch of different ideas that we're still exploring, or is that what you've condensed down to somewhat of a plan, a draft plan to touch base on every single one of these?
Yeah, the latter. So this is that's not to say that you all can't provide feedback tonight and decide that maybe one of these actions is the city is not interested in pursuing. But at this point, the list here is the draft that would be included in the final report that the city would be implementing over the next 8 years.
Thank you.
Alex, you have your hand raised.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Oh, great. Wonderful. I just wanted to make the point, and I think you'll make this when you describe a couple of these more in depth, but several of these strategies and actions have their own required steps that are either required by state law or typical practice. So there could be a process to implement one of these, one or more of many of these things actually, that is happens in the time frame allotted, that allows the city to calibrate, customize some of the particulars of some of these tools. And the customization and the particulars are not meant to be memorialized in the housing production strategy. It's just a commitment to explore these as part of your actions associated with producing housing. So it's a menu of things that you're signing up to do in some fashion, but that doing could just be exploring and going through the required steps.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. All right, I'm going to keep us moving and go through a couple actions here. So the first one here is the multi-unit property tax exemption, or now I'm going to just refer to it as MUPTE. We touched on this last time, but I want to make sure that you all understand it and can answer or have any questions answered about this program. So what we're recommending is that the city design and adopt the MUPTE program to replace the vertical housing tax zone that the city currently has as a tax incentive. So part of that reason is because the vertical housing tax zone, so that will sunset in 2026 by the state. So that's a state program that cities can implement. And so the state is looking to kind of sunset and have, if jurisdictions are interested in having a tax incentive program, to use the MUPTE program. So what it is it's a 10-year partial exemption on property taxes. Each project would be approved by city council. So it would go through a process that ultimately the city council can decide if it meets the criteria and the goals that were outlined in the program to receive that type of incentive. So it is a state enabled program, but it provides a lot of flexibility and opportunity for the city to shape how that would be implemented, such as, so you can set the geography of where the exemption is available. So for instance, if you were looking to have an urban renewal area, maybe you wouldn't include a tax exemption program, given that both of those are within kind of taxing programs. So you can be pretty wide. You can go over the whole city, or you can be pretty selective in where this program would be implemented or allowed. You can define the process and fees. So some jurisdictions have a third-party reviewer, given that as part of your application of someone who would be interested in going through this, they have to provide a pro forma. So they have to demonstrate that a program like this, it would allow the project to be feasible. And so you can hire out so that there isn't as much of an administrative burden on city staff to review all of the details. And you can create a fee associated with that to essentially pay a third party person to review that application. You can also define the program requirements and criteria. So you can choose if you want it to be for projects for 10 years. So is it a affordable homeownership opportunity that would the different projects would have to meet that, or would it be accessible units? You could have multiple, but really that's the opportunity for the city to decide what is the housing type or tenure or things like that that you would want to incentivize with a program like this. And then lastly, there are program caps. So you can decide how many programs or how many applications can be approved in a year. So you're not, committing to 30 projects in 1 year. You're being more intentional over the life of this this program and how many can be approved. And then you can see on the right here the examples of cities that offer the program. So for instance, in Florence, their program is for 3 units and more. So you could also include like fourplexes or triplexes in this type of a program, or you could be selective that it's only for developments over 30 units or something like that too. So you can kind of decide how many units and the size of the project that would be would receive this incentive.
Would this also include cottage cluster type development?
You could include that. Yeah, because it could be, you could have it be 4 units or something. And so that would include cottage clusters or townhomes even. So you could be kind of wide in the different housing types that could receive this type of an incentive.
So would we have to add in another section into the Title 10 for the city code for entering this in? Because to have certain standards for this to be approved.
No, this would be this would be outside of the municipal code. There could be reference to it in the municipal code, but it would be a program that lives outside of it, similar to with the city currently has a vertical housing tax zone that is outside of the municipal code. And this would be, you know, as I mentioned in the description, we may have touched on that. That program, it's looking like, is going away at the state level. And that program has very specific parameters that you have to meet for it to be eligible for vertical housing tax credits. The city implemented that in what, 2014? And since then, we've had one project that's taken advantage of it. So we would the goal with MUPD, it would be a lot more flexible. So, you know, obviously we would be able to encourage far more development than just, you know, the one that there is. But yeah, the vertical housing tax zone, it's looking like it's going away around 2026. So this would be something that we're being, you know, throughout the state, they're encouraging communities to take on the MUPD to take place of the vertical housing tax zone.
Alex, do you have anything to add? I know you're a MUPD expert in
Oh yeah.
our team.
No, I think even if the program you have on the books wasn't going away, we'd probably recommend this tool because it allows you a lot more ability to customize the types of housing and the other types of outcomes you want to see on the ground. So it allows you to tailor the tool to where your housing needs are, which could include things like we're talked about, middle housing, cottage housing. You know, it tends to work for rental housing. That's the type of housing it works for. But beyond that, there's a lot of customizing that can happen at the local level, far beyond what the vertical housing program allows. So it's a better fit for most communities.
Two comments, if I may, and one's just a little nitpicky out of the gate, but should we be looking at these slides as the city will adopt MUPD, or should we be at that level here about saying we'll explore or try? Because one of the bullet points in the document sent out is that 50% of the taxing districts have to agree to it. So we can try to adopt it, but it may not be entirely within our control. And that component is not on this summary slide and is probably the most critical component to that whole process, would be my impression. So kind of two parts there. Should we be looking that fine at the title of this or a little bit further out?
Yeah, you're welcome to be specific in the language used. So I think it can get a little nuanced. And so I think maybe where we say adopt versus explore adopting this program is that this is one that we feel the city should really try as much effort to adopt versus maybe the urban renewal area. It's a little more flexible in that 8 years you explore it, but you don't actually act on starting an urban renewal area and going through the process. But that's not to say that if you all would feel more comfortable at being explore. Again, it gets back to as you report to the to DLCD, so the Department of Land Conservation and Development, who oversees housing production strategy program at the state level. It's out of your control if the taxing jurisdictions deny a MUPD program. And so you can still show that you made every effort to do that and you went through the adoption process, but in the end it didn't get adopted because of that. So, you could then make an argument for including explore for this program or is saying adopt for the urban renewal areas. So if the city would feel more comfortable as it being explore, we can modify that language. Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I think that you raise an interesting point, and I think it's can throw some folks off. Typically, to achieve the 51%, that just requires either the county or the school district in most jurisdictions to participate alongside the city. And so it's not a bunch of different conversations and convincing you have to do. It tends to be one additional larger taxing entity that has to be willing to participate alongside you. And so the threshold seems rather high, but as a practical matter, it's just one other usually.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I can move on to the next action. All right, I'll move on. So the next one here is explore a construction excise tax for additional affordable housing revenue. So this would be the city exploring both a construction excise tax on residential and non-residential, so commercial or industrial construction. And so what that is it would be a tax on the permit valuation. So how much the valuation of the construction project. You can tax up to 1% for residential construction permits. And so what that is it would be on any essentially additional square footage. So it would be a new structure or an addition to a structure. So if someone was working within the confines of the building already existing, then that wouldn't trigger this this tax. So the city has the opportunity to also include taxing commercial and industrial taxes, but then there's no cap on the rate. So the city could look to and tax a 1.5% on the permit valuation. And so, we look at the non-residential as an opportunity for the kind of connection between different commercial or industrial employment, also investing in housing in the community. And so that's one way to kind of look at including the non-residential. So the city of Hood River and Hood River County have a construction excise tax program. They adopted it in 2017 on both residential and non-residential construction. And it's a 1% for both, except in the county, they only apply a 0.75% tax on manufactured housing. So there's a little bit of a reduction there. There's also exemptions or partial exemptions. So you can choose not to tax affordable housing developments, accessory dwelling units. They have some for nonprofit operated facilities like group homes or other types of nonprofit facilities that kind of meet certain communities' needs. So it can be flexible in how you implement this program on different types of housing or choose to exempt different types. So yeah.
Quick question on that. Can you base it on like total, like when it comes to residential, can you base it on like the total valuation? Maybe not just affordable housing, but the valuation of the project itself. Because I look at, we try to remove barriers when we're building housing. You add a tax to a residential unit, and almost, I understand it's in place to assist with affordable housing development, but adding an additional tax onto a house seems like it could create another barrier. It's kind of like a double-edged sword, I guess, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. That is kind of a fact of that program. And that is something that you could choose to not tax residential permits, or you could choose to make it for specific types like single family homes or something. You could be kind of selective in what is essentially what's exempted.
Yeah.
So that you could exempt cottage cluster plexes. You could choose to decide how to tax that. But yeah, that is a double-edged sword of adding a tax on residential development.
Yeah, because I know in Hood River, it's a great example to show, having construction excise tax, how it's being used. I've seen some of the studies, some of the breakdowns on it. But of course, over there, they're building houses in the probably 800 to $1.2 million range, and it's not to say that that isn't a need that it's being filled over there. It's maybe having it higher. I'll just be blunt. If someone can afford to build an $800,000 house, then maybe adding a tax to something like that might be a little more, to assist with affordable housing, compared to a developer that's coming in that's trying to place manufactured homes. It's trying to place units that are trying to keep it below 300,000. Maybe looking at not taxing at a certain price point. Just my initial thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's a part of the exploring component, is that you can
Yeah.
choose to decide, A, if maybe this isn't the right program for the city, but to have more information, kind of assessing what that looks like. You could even talk to other jurisdictions that have implemented, like Hood River, to understand kind of how they've seen it impact development in their community. So yeah, this is definitely an opportunity to explore this as a way to generate funds to support affordable housing. I will kind of go through what that breakdown looks like. So if you were to implement this, how can you use those funds? So on residential developments, 15% would have to go to the Oregon Housing and Community Services, which is a state department. They have a down payment assistance program. So some of the funds that you would collect would go towards that. The rest would be for the city. So 35% could be for city or county affordable housing programs or incentives. And then half of that would be for developer incentives. So, and again, this is flexible. You could choose what you would want to use these funds for. But for instance, you could use it for fee waivers, SDC waivers, different finance based. So you could, as the project's coming online, if they need some pre-development funds to kind of assess developing an affordable housing development, you could, use some funds to help pay for that. There you can kind of see it's a little bit small, but the city can reserve up to 4% to cover administrative costs of this type of a program. On the non-residential side, it's a lot more flexible. So 50% are for local housing programs. So kind of the 85% on the left there, and then half is unrestricted. So you all could decide what to use those funds for. You could use it for infrastructure improvements that you may want to prioritize for housing development. You could be pretty flexible in how those funds could be used, but that's kind of the difference between the two programs at how the state allows cities to administer a construction excise tax. The next slide here is showing what this looks like in Hood River. So this is an example of a project. They have a 2,000 square foot house with a 440 square foot garage. So that calculated valuation is $266,000. Sorry, it is a little bit small, but essentially it would be generating $2,600 in to go towards a construction excise tax kind of program. So for context, Hood River has generated over $400,000 last year in their construction excise tax program that can be used for affordable housing programs and incentives. It's both.
For commercial and residential? Okay, and when they talk about the calculated valuation, that's the assessed value, not the market value. Like that's the value upon which it would be taxed on, not the market value, like what something would be sold at.
That's my understanding. Alex, is that your understanding as well? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, just off the top of our head, how many building permits were like submitted for in 2023 or even this year? Do we know that? I feel like it's somewhere in this in this whole thing somewhere.
12 this year. I think last year was somewhere around 2023. I think it was somewhere around, 30 to 35. I think we have it broken down in this report. It's something that I have mentioned in previous conversations where it is much lower than the city of Hood River.
Yeah, I was gonna say I know it for sure it's less than 50, and we're exploring this topic. And I have a second question about that. I'm just wondering, like, is this something that is going to actually work here? Like, we don't have that volume of new construction. And I'm wondering if inhibiting it in any way is going to put us in a less advantageous position. Not necessarily from a affordable housing, what these taxes are and fees are collected and used for, but also just as like getting people to come to town and build here for whatever reason it may be. The second question I have is when we talk about formally exploring these ideas, does that mean it has to be more than just this conversation here, right? Like it needs to be like a formal session with either city council or planning commission or one of the work groups. Okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit more than right now.
Right. Well, yeah, I knew that, but yeah.
But yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think to the first point, I mean, a lot of this is planning for the future. We'll get to the hands raised in a second. A lot of this is planning for the future. We may be at 35 now, but the hope would be to double that. I mean, ultimately, we're twice the size of Hood River, but Hood River is producing twice as many houses as we are here. So there's definitely, that's something that we noted in the very beginning when we started very first meetings with Cascadia Partners. I've always been scratching my head at those numbers and those statistics. Land is typically a little bit cheaper in the Dalles. Houses are a bit cheaper in the Dalles. We're twice the size, but we're not producing as much. So what is creating those, what barriers are here that are not elsewhere? So, I mean, as part of this whole thing, of course, it's something that within the next 8 years, I'd really like to see those numbers rise.
Go ahead and turn it over to the hands raised. Looks like was Roger first.
Yeah, it would be nice if you could share a screen so we could see what you guys are seeing up there on your screen as you go through all of these different things you're considering. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Are other Alex or Nick, are you
I'm
seeing
seeing the screen.
Yeah, I am
Okay.
too.
I'm seeing Alex, I'm seeing you guys, but I'm not seeing anything else.
You might have to change, let's see, where would it be? The view in the top right, there's a little view icon that allows you to sort of change all the things, people's faces plus the presentation.
Speaker, gallery, multi-speaker.
It would be standard, would be the
I don't have that.
well, shoot.
This
Yeah,
is
it's
because
one
I
of the
have
settings.
freebie. I don't think the freebie program has that.
How much are we actually gonna get out of it?
Well, I just wanted to hop in and say that I don't want to talk over someone. I can hear someone speaking, so.
Oh no, you're good. Go for it.
Okay. The numbers on all these tools are not by themselves enough to solve all of, the Dalles housing problems. And I think that's sort of stands out when you look at one tool in isolation. The horsepower that it generates is not enough to solve all the problems, but together as a package, as a set of strategies, they can make an important difference. And the velocity of a housing market is slow until it's fast. And so while the numbers generated on an annual basis may measure less than the Hood River, what Hood River is generating, maybe even significantly, those numbers can get dialed up over time as housing production increases, and also compounded over 10, 15 years, that those numbers can add up. And the second thing is, you can be selective in terms of the types of new development that you impose a construction excise tax on, as we've talked about. It can be limited to commercial or industrial. It can extend to commercial, industrial, and residential. So there's some calibration here that can help you address the concerns around making development more expensive. That is the sort of central issue that you have to wrestle with this particular tool, though. It is a tax on new development to fund a certain type of other development that is affordable housing. And that's just the mechanics of the tool. And so calibrating it in such a way that it doesn't turn off the market, but can support needed housing types is the exact right way to think about going into the calibration process as a next step.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. John, it looks like you were about to say something.
Yes. So In the beginning sessions, we were talking about, we looked at the different graphs between the Dalles, Wasco County, Oregon, or the Oregon state as a whole, and then Hood River County. And then can't remember the years that we were looking at, but or Wasco County and the Dalles was right on par with Oregon in the high 2 percentile in available homes. And then we saw Hood River, which was in the very low 2 percentile in housing. So they were struggling more than we are in available housing. So I'm just kind of curious about, with doing a construction excise tax in 2017, yes, that they've got to build houses. So they're kind of at a point where they have to build these no matter what. Was there any growth stunted there within Hood River from putting in a construction excise tax? And then also, will this, it kind of seems counterproductive, because we also want to bring jobs to the Dalles to be able to support a higher population, or, for the houses that we're building. So.
Yeah, the first question, unfortunately, I can't answer to know how that has potentially impacted development in Hood River, as far as or less homes developed because of a tax like this, or not. I think that's something that you could talk to the city about, and the county, to understand how they've seen an impact like a construction excise tax on their housing production. And then to your second question, I'm sorry, I completely forgot the second one.
So it was the graph that we place with the availability of homes. So they're being in the low 2%, just what the years were that were captured, because I remember that graph. I just don't remember the years that were captured.
Yeah. So that was a vacancy rate of housing in the Dalles and Hood River, the state and the county. And those years were, I believe it was a 10-year period. So I believe it was 2010, or would it be 2014 to 2024? I'd have to look, but it's a 10-year period that's just kind of analyzing over the last 10 years, kind of what's that shift been in housing vacancy rates within those different data points. And I remember your other one was related to employment. Is it disincentivizing new commercial or industrial development by having a tax? Which it could. Yeah. I mean, this is one where if you all decide that you want to include this in the housing production strategy report, is to explore kind of what that impact could look like too. You could, again, talk to other jurisdictions that have implemented this program to understand if it's had impacts on different employment opportunities. Again, you can also, it doesn't have to be 1% too. You could choose to do a 0.5%. Like, you could be flexible in how you decide to implement this, that it wouldn't create an additional burden or barrier to different developments. Alex, yeah, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just two other final thoughts on this. One is that, to what Lydia said, you can dial this down to a point when you're sort of engaging with stakeholders through the process of calibration. You can dial it down to a point where you feel like it's market feasible. And I think that's an important step of this process. The last thing you'd want to do is calibrate it in such a way that it turns off other investment in your economy. But what a lot of communities have been able to do is sort of right size it for what's feasible. And then what it does, importantly, is help to generate a little modest pot of money that can be used to leverage a lot more money. So one of the things that local communities oftentimes struggle to do is bring local matching funds to affordable housing projects. Those monies are oftentimes required as a condition of state or federal affordable housing funding that measure in the many millions, and the local contribution usually measures in the hundreds of thousands, if that. So it helps having more ways to produce that what's called gap money, a set of gap funds that are relatively small but critically important to leveraging to get those state and federal funds. Having more ability to generate those modest sums of money over time is really what tools like this are about. So they can be small but important in the grand scheme of affordable housing finance. So just another consideration, setting it to be realistic, but having more of these kinds of tools to allow you to unlock those outside dollars.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I'll also mention, so the city of Newport on the coast looked at including a construction excise tax. And so they did an analysis. They brought in a consultant to do that. So I think looking to that as an opportunity, if this is included in the report, to kind of look at an analysis like that was conducted to better understand and do some of that market assessment of what would the impact be like and what would be market feasible that would not hinder developments or, just have them decide that they don't want to build a new commercial building or something like that. So that's a way to kind of look at how you could explore implementing this type of a program. All right, I will move on to, yeah, of course.
The OHCS program that the 15% goes to, is there any prioritization for that money coming back to communities that have the construction excise tax, or is it distributed around the state?
That's a great question. And I'm not certain on that. I'm happy to follow up and let you know what that is. That's a great question though. And I see Alex dropped off. He may know that better than me. Oh, there he is again. Hey, Alex, do you know of that 15% that goes to OHCS down payment assistance? Do cities that have the tax, a CET, do they get priority, or is there any sort of priority for folks that contribute to that assistance fund?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer. So we will have to follow up with you on that.
Okay, yeah, we will do that though. Okay, last one, and then I want to just open it up for overall questions on any of the other actions that haven't been touched on tonight, and make sure that you all feel comfortable with the list that's included right now in the draft report. So this last one here is to engage in land banking with partner organizations. So this is looking at acquiring and holding key sites. And by that, it can mean many different things. It can be the city has identified surplus land that they have that could be prioritized for housing development, or a partner like the county has a piece of property that here in that second bullet, I say that this is kind of the third step in the land-based action. So you have an inventory, you decide of these surplus properties, 3 of these would be feasible for housing development. And so one of those, you would go through what's called a land banking process. And so you would identify a partner organization, such as the Housing Authority has a community land trust. And so you could partner with them to develop housing on that site. So the city wouldn't be a developer, but would kind of be the pass through for a partner, a nonprofit organization that could develop housing on a piece of land that is maybe not needed by the city or one of its partners. So it does require funding and administrative capacity just to go through the process of identifying land and kind of going through the steps of transferring the ownership and different things like that if the city is interested in preparing the site for housing development. But really this is committing the city to exploring as they identify sites that are potentially available for housing development that's surplus to kind of go through a process of having a development on that site for housing. And this could be kind of meeting different key housing needs. So you could decide it has to be affordable at 80% of the median area income, or it could be lower. You could kind of decide this is a really big chip that the city has when it comes to housing development is land. It's can be scarce and it also can be very expensive. So this is kind of looking at the way that the city can play an active role in housing development with land that it has or its partners have. So that is the last of the key actions. Are there, of the ones I want to highlight, are there any questions related to this action here on land banking? All right. Okay, so I have some questions for you and I'll pull up the long list. So do you have any additional guidance for how the city can best implement these actions? So you see in any of in each action there are implementation consideration and steps. So how can the city best implement this action? How can it kind of consider populations or different housing types that can meet different needs by those different actions, things like that. What questions or comments do you have to feel comfortable including the actions in this draft report in the final version? And then lastly, are there any insights in how these can be most effectively used, or any other questions or comments on that action list? So I'll go back to the list here, and really, you don't have to answer one of those questions. You can also ask us a question, but really want to open it up for you all on this list. And if there are any that you don't feel comfortable including in the final version, or if you have questions on, happy to answer those.
I have a question. Action 2.2, maximum density. Think about 3 years ago now, we changed our zoning ordinances, really reduced our minimum lot size, changed how we calculate density, changed how we calculate units on specific lots. I'm not asking, well, I guess I am. Do we need to do that again? Like we hammered that pretty good for like a year.
Yeah, so as we evaluated the different maximum densities in your zones, particularly when you think about infill sites and different kind of smaller sites like that, it can be hard to meet the maximum density. So we generally would say for like a medium density zone, and I'd have to go back to look exactly what your maximum densities are for each of your zones. But essentially, it could create a barrier while you have that minimum lot size that you modified. There still can be density maximums that can be pushed against that could become a barrier to developing different housing types on potentially, like, for instance, infill sites.
Okay.
And it was my understanding, Josh, correct me, but part of the density work that you all did was to kind of calibrate it so there weren't inconsistencies or kind of within the.
Yeah, that was the big, I think this was 2022. That was the big thing that we were doing. We had two different standards for density in our code, and it just they didn't equate to the same thing. And ultimately it resulted in increasing our density, but really what we did is we based it off of there used to be a range of how many units you could put on an acre of land. And then there's minimum lot sizes. Well, if your minimum lot size, if you multiply your minimum lot size by what's allowed in the zone, you need them to be equal. So that's why we used to be what, 10 to 25 units per acre in a high density zone. Now you'll see it's 29 point something, because what it's based off of is your minimum lot size. But yeah, to your point, it's it provided some clarity, which resulted in an increase. But definitely something worth exploring. I mean, I didn't maybe I'm one to always be in support of increasing density when we can. But we would definitely want to take a look like the feasibility of it, because I do know that, I mean, currently 29 units per acre that's a good amount for a city this size.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, if people don't feel comfortable with one of these actions, it does not need to be included in the final report. Of course, we want to present something that supports. I think when some of the reasoning too behind increasing some of the maximum densities, particularly looking at near your downtown and things like that too, is you have the various other standards like setbacks and height and different things like that. So there's still an envelope that a building can't surpass, but could they, in the goal of having smaller, more affordable units, add more units in the same kind of shoebox? But it's just allowing that additional kind of opportunity to have smaller units. Yeah, of course, if you have other questions or if you want to follow up to after this, to as you kind of ruminate on this, we're happy to answer those or kind of consider not including one in this housing production strategy.
I mean, I like a lot of these ideas. One of them, but one of them I'm not so much a fan of, and I don't know if I'd like to see it on there. And I'm not sure how everybody else feels, but action 4.1 with the construction excise tax. I mean, I think that, you know, that would be something that maybe the city council can explore at a later date. But as far as plan, you know, I don't know if that's something that we'd want to be obligated to.
And do other folks feel similarly?
I guess I feel like putting it out at that 7 to 8 years gives us some flexibility to think about how the market looks at that time and if it makes sense to explore, and having some pretty squishy language about how we do that, but having it on the agenda to at least be a consideration depending on how things are going then, I think seems like we wouldn't, I mean, I guess taking it off doesn't necessarily take it off the list of potential tools, but keeping it on there, I think, is a good reminder that it's out there.
Yeah, and exploring it is just exploring it. Like we can always explore it and say this still doesn't work, or excuse me, we can always explore it and say this doesn't work. I think there needs to be some quantitative studies that go along with that idea for sure.
Yeah, and that can be one of the steps in the implementation of this action, is to hire a consultant, a third party, to assess the feasibility of this action, or this, for instance, this construction excise tax. And you can decide after that yeah, this isn't the time for the city to adopt it, or this just doesn't seem feasible for our community. So kind of to Cody's point, this is exploring that. But again, if other folks don't feel comfortable, we can of course reevaluate including it in the list.
Because I remembered with regard to that, y'all had mentioned that that tax was like a way that the city would kind of like fund like low income type programs, those kind of benefits. And so I wonder if, along with exploring like what that tax, like how that tax would function and if it's feasible, if there are ways to explore like other opportunities to within this dimension to like fund low income housing. Like what are the other ways that it could happen if not by taxing new construction? If does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes total sense. And I think not to get too quickly to the punchline, but there are relatively few ways local jurisdictions have to generate additional revenue for the purposes that this kind of tool can use, you know, can be directed. So to generate small but dedicated sources of revenue. And the other tools that are really on the menu, if you will, are actually on this list. Many or several of them. One, most importantly, is urban renewal areas. Right. So CETs are an additional tax, right? It's dialing up the tax bill on certain types of development for the purposes of funding affordable housing. Urban renewal is capturing it in an area for a period of time and recycling it in that area, in that smaller area, like a downtown or a district, for the purposes of affordable housing, amongst other things. It can be used for a broad range of things. So the menu of options that you have is quite limited. and it's one of the reasons why CET often appears on the menu, is that it's among a really small handful of outlets that the city has for generating this kind of revenue.
I
So
wonder,
there's
no,
not a
yeah.
lot of other options. Sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful to know. And like I wonder if along like when you do include the information with like the tax on the new construction, if part of that data could be like a comparison of like with the projected new construction that we have, like this is like the amount that you could have to dedicate toward low income housing versus if you did not make this tax, like this is what you as a city could potentially be missing out on.
Yep. That's
Cool.
exactly the kind of analysis that would be included in the recommended next steps for that action.
Rad. Thank you.
And I'm happy to share with Josh. I mentioned the City of Newport's analysis, so I'm happy to share that so you all can see what that would look like and what would be included in that type of an analysis, if that would be helpful.
Maybe a comment that I would have for the commission and city council, and looking at this work plan here, is that everything takes staff time, and no comment from the on the consultant's part or anything, but we have a half dozen or a dozen plans that some of them have sat on the shelf for a while, and some of the other plans are being finalized as we speak. And so even in year 1 and 2, we have 6 potential action items. That's this one housing production strategies report. If we have 10 plans for the various departments amongst the whole city, that's 60 action items in a 2-year period. So I just raised that it all takes staff work, it all takes time, it all takes effort, takes your time, volunteer effort. And that when we're looking at this 1 to 8 years, that we feel strongly that these different actions are landing in the right year. And so again, even action 1.1, housing working group, that's a significant lift just by itself. So I just add that for context and looking at this list here. And the work that we would potentially undertake. The city council will be meeting for a facilitated goal setting session in November. And we're hoping to look at plans such as this, final drafts adopted or otherwise, to help inform that session. And that's where a lot of these pieces may really kind of come together, and from input from staff and anybody who chooses to attend that meetings, and most notably the city council itself. That's how we kind of look at and align what we're going to undertake over the next year. And a lot of that is dictated by what we can undertake with the resources that we have. So just wanted to make that note.
A work session?
November 15th, I believe.
So not to jump ahead, but just so you all know, I can come back to, I'm not trying to end the discussion, but so we're projected to have a kind of final draft of the report by December 15th. So that's not to say in November 15th, when you all have a work session, that you can't kind of evaluate the list and still further refine it. So just as a heads up, there'll still be a month after that work session to complete a draft of the report, or a final draft of the report.
Quick question, Lydia. In the event that we potentially remove any of these actions from our list, we may have talked about this before. What's the sweet spot of, there's 19 here. It is a lot of work. They're very exciting, but it is a lot of work that goes behind. In the event we were to drop a couple of them here and there, what is acceptable, I guess, as required by the state?
So there isn't a set number of actions that you have to take. There's not like, if you go under 15, then you're out of compliance with that housing production strategy. Those are my next couple slides. Is there are other elements of the report that you have to demonstrate that you're making steps to meet various housing needs. And so, as we think about analyzing these different actions and strategies to meet those needs, obviously there's a tipping point if you remove enough of them that you're starting to maybe not meet certain needs, whether that's housing type or tenure or different populations. But I wouldn't say that there's a sweet spot. It is dependent on each local jurisdiction and your capacity and interest in the different actions here. Something that we've done with other housing production strategy reports is obviously the draft list that you had from July and then this draft report. There can be a section of actions that were considered but were not included that you all could reference as, you know, if in that 8-year period we at the time didn't feel comfortable including the construction excise tax action, but it's still something that the city is interested in pursuing maybe at the next housing production strategy report or things like that too. So you can still have those kind of on the list, but just not in the final list that the city is committed to.
Thanks.
I had a couple of thoughts that I wanted to share. First, on this topic, I think it'd be really helpful to understand from city staff. I know you guys are just getting staff back up in the planning department, but what you think is realistic on the implementation timeline would be greatly appreciated so that we can be supportive of right-sizing the list and talking about priorities within the actual capacity the city has. Because there's a lot of great stuff on there, but I'd like to be thoughtful about making sure that the things that are included are things that we can really make some progress on. And then a couple of specific ones. I'd love to see in the housing working group one, some reference to some of the populations that are identified earlier in the report that are having challenges accessing housing, some engagement with them in that working group to make sure that we're understanding and meeting the needs of those populations that are having a hard time accessing the housing they need in our community. Keeping in mind the caveat that I understand capacity challenges, a couple pieces feel like they could be either low-hanging fruit or important to start earlier. The first one was just thinking about the pre-approved plans, that seems like a pretty straightforward one to move forward with, that if it was available as a tool over the period of implementation, that we'd have more opportunity to see an impact there. And I would imagine most of that is outsourced work. Obviously not completely, but a good chunk. And then I'd love to see the land banking piece move up a little bit in the implementation process, just because I think part of the value there could be getting access to and keeping some of that land available as it's more affordable. And I don't think it's getting cheaper here. So making sure that we're planning for the future as our housing prices continue to rise and our cost of land continues to rise. So we're not getting in the same kind of situation that Hood River's in, where it's incredibly expensive to access that land to land bank for affordable housing moving forward.
Thank you for those points. Those are great additions. Thank you. Josh, do you have anything to add to the capacity and timeline statement question?
Just to clarify, I don't expect a response to that now, but if you guys have a chance to take a look at it and really think about refining that, it would be appreciated.
Well, if I may, just when looking at this list, years 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are heavy, and then 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 are lighter. And so, I mean, if you were to put me on the spot, I may make the comment of slide 1 or 2 actions from years 1 and 2 into 3 and 4, and then 3 actions from 3 and 4 into 5 and 6. But that's kind of a complicated exercise to do right now, but that's in line with that comment.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, this is a draft version, so would love additional feedback from you all, and when we can further refine what these timelines look like too. So absolutely want to be realistic of the capacity, and again, as I mentioned earlier, that's not to say that you push out one of these other strategies like the infrastructure prioritization, for instance, that you still aren't making steps between now and then of what you're committing to. So this is kind of guidelines, but the city can be flexible in those.
Yeah, and we can work with, we'll work with the team here over these next, few weeks and months to, hammer these out a little bit more. I do think, there's a lot of these things that, there's a lot of pieces that go into some of these things, and maybe some we're already working on, potentially. So, yeah, we'll take a closer look at that. But I mean, I kind of agree with you on the pre-approved plans. I've been excited about the pre-approved plan idea for years now. I sat down with DLCD probably 5 years ago before it was really picking up at the state level. And the conversation didn't really go anywhere, but at that time I was very interested, and I've kept my eyes on many different cities that have pre-approved plans. We had in our advisory committee meeting the other day, there was the recommendation by one of our members that, we should look around the state. Is there other examples around the state? The state has a pre-built plan set currently available for, garages and things of that nature. And there's like few communities that have, maybe ADU plans or single family home plans. What I was excited to hear from our group, the push from our advisory committee is, let's try to, those plans are out there already free and available. Let's take it up a notch and see if there's duplexes and triplex plans that can be readily available in this community. So on a personal note, I would be interested in moving the pre-approved plans forward, but we definitely be mindful of bandwidth.
Along with moving stuff around, I think that we can move maximum density to probably year 5 or 6. We put some time into that, and I don't think we haven't even seen that like cycle through the community and people building and things like that. And I think it'd be appropriate. I think that'd be an appropriate and organic timeline to revisit that in year 5 or 6 anyway. But yeah, we got done spending a lot of time on that. I think it's pretty sharp right now.
Absolutely, we can shift these timelines. Is there any other feedback? Otherwise I can keep going, but yeah, Carrie.
And the rental cost information that's in there, is that a prescribed data source for this kind of plan? Because I know the Housing Authority did a deep dive study a few years back, though I guess the numbers surprised me. Less than $1,000 is the median rent in town. Does not seem accurate.
What year? Sorry.
Oh, that's
So the data that we pulled is from the
That was
census
pretty-
data. So there's the American Community Survey data that produces different data points that includes median rent. And so that's where that data point comes from.
we have to use that data point.
So we have to ground some of those findings in data.
The Housing Authority did like a HUD approved process a few years back because the data for this area is so bad. And if there's an opportunity to use that data that might be more reflective of reality on the ground and some of the housing cost burdens that are happening in our community, I think it would better show what's happening on the ground and what the need is here.
Yeah, we can absolutely reference also what the data that the Housing Authority put together too. Thank you. All right, well, I will keep moving, given I know we're already at an hour and a half. So I have a couple things to wrap up, and then we'll be done. So the last point I want to make about the housing production strategy. So there's a section that's not in your draft that will be included in the final version, which is it's an achieving fair and equitable housing section. So it's required by the state statute to be included. And so what it does is it identifies how each of the actions that are proposed in the final version address specific population and housing types. So each action we have to kind of filter through these different kind of sections here. So the location of housing, fair housing. So how is the city affirmatively furthering fair housing for different state and federally protected classes? Housing choice. So looking how housing choices for specific communities to facilitating access, affordable home ownership and rental housing, So how is the city supporting and creating opportunities? And then lastly, here on this slide is gentrification, displacement, and housing stability. So how is each of these actions kind of considering the potential kind of impacts that it can make. And then the last section is an assessment of benefits and burdens. So kind of, again, filtering through each of these actions and how it's either benefiting specific communities or burdening them so that the city can analyze and address those potential benefits and burdens. As we've developed these actions over the last, I guess, 8 months now, we've been thinking about this. So this isn't to modify the actions further. This is just to demonstrate how each of these actions meet these different points here. So you will see that in the final version as well. So I just want to make that note. Okay, so next steps. So as I mentioned, there will be the final draft that the city will adopt. That will be completed by December 15th. And as Josh mentioned, the final report will be going to City Council for adoption in 2025, early in January. So while this is the last time I'm here to actually meet with you all in person, as I've mentioned, this can be further refined based on your feedback. We're still going to be meeting with the city. So the draft that you're seeing now will still be modified by the time it gets to City Council hearing. So please email Josh, me with any questions or comments that we can make this a report that you all feel good about and are willing to support. So thank you all so much. All right, I'll stop sharing.
That concludes the discussion item. Yes. All right. Staff had any comments or project updates?
Oh yeah, I'll just be real quick. I know that we've had there's been a couple cancellations for planning commission. We haven't had a lot of business. We will be bringing on a senior planner after a long search starting next week. So excited to kind of get the wheels in motion again on some of these projects that we've outlined. But I do know that there's going to be 2 conversations coming up in November. One of them is actually something that will be discussed not only with the Planning Commission, but also City Council. There are new requirements that FEMA has laid out just very recently. They're called PICMs. They are implementation strategies that the city is required to implement. We have to choose a PICM by December 1st. And at this point, we do not have a lot of information as to what the pick'ems are. There's a list of 3. One of them is basically a moratorium on development within the floodplain, which everybody around basically said that's a no-go. Every community in the state. The other is implementing a model ordinance that FEMA has already created. That model ordinance has to be modified to every single community specific to your community. So there's a lot of work going into that. Model ordinances, it's an ordinance. It has to go through a multi-month process to get it actually adopted in a community. And then the other one is something based on it's a permit by permit basis. So it's ultimately I'll use Lone Pine as an example. Every single house in Lone Pine would have to come in and submit their own individual study of the property itself. So it's adding a lot more work for developers as well as a lot more work for staff. We are also in the midst of FEMA taking a very long time to update the map that we use. We use a map that's from 1984 and it's yet to be updated. We started updating it in 2014 and it's still not updated. They're expecting now, I think, pushing it to maybe 2026 it'll be adopted. So we're kind of in this situation where we have to implement these new requirements on individuals who may soon be out of the floodplain or may soon be in the floodplain. So it's going to create a little bit of a notification nightmare. I'll just say that. But the FEMA has finally announced just this week, I think yesterday, workshops. Everybody's been waiting for these workshops to come out that are going to discuss these pick'ems. Within a half hour, they were already booked up pretty far out into October, but I our staff here is able to attend at the end of October. So the soonest we're going to be bringing this in front of you most likely is the second meeting at the second planning commission meeting in November. So we can actually digest this information, bring it ahead. And then also we will be presenting it to city council. So city council can make the decision on what we are going to choose. And then we have until July of 2025 to actually implement that. So very quick timeline. We ultimately found out about it in July, and there is a lot of pushback, as you can imagine, from all of the communities within the state. The governor's office has submitted a letter earlier this week to FEMA. So I just wanted to let everybody know that there's going to be some, you're going to feel like it's probably we're rushing into something, or why are you bringing this to our attention only a couple days before? So we don't have the information yet. So we're doing our best. And then the other is going to be actually an urban renewal matter. Currently, the Urban Renewal Agency is looking at increasing what's called maximum indebtedness. That's the Urban Renewal Agency's spending authority. So we have a couple urban renewal board members in the room here. They're very familiar with what we've been discussing over these past few months, but part of that process is it's ultimately a city council decision, but part of the process is bringing the idea in front of the planning commission to make sure, basically get concurrence from the planning commission that this change or this increase in the maximum indebtedness will not be contrary to the comprehensive plan. So with that, that's all I got. And I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Any commissioner comments or questions?
I checked the calendar and there is a council retreat on November 15th, and I don't have a time. It's probably morning. Oh, good God. All right.
All good then? Meeting adjourned. Thank you all so much.